A virgin girl was sentenced to hang until a Comanche warrior challenged the law that condemns her. Red Bluff, New Mexico, spring of 1878. The sun hung low over the adobe rooftops, bleeding orange light across a town that had long since forgotten mercy. The air tasted of dust and sweat, thick with the weight of expectation. In the center of the square, a rough wooden platform had been thrown together with more haste than care. The gallows pole creaked gently in the wind, the noose already swaying as if impatient. Sarah May stood barefoot atop the planks, wrists bound in rawhide, her pale cotton dress torn at the hem. Her lip was cracked, her left cheek swollen. A bruise ringed her neck just above the collarbone, half faded but unmistakable. She was 19, but the way she looked down at her feet made her seem younger, or older, or simply lost. The crowd pressed forward, a mix of miners, merchants, and mothers holding children by the hand. They had come not for justice, but for confirmation that their fear still ruled, that their borders were still marked in blood and obedience. On the courthouse steps, Mayor Cutler stood in a brown wool coat 2 sizes too fine for the desert. His voice rose over the crowd, sharp and deliberate. "This town will not tolerate violence," he declared, "not even from a Mexican stray." A murmur rippled outward like a dropped stone. Some nodded, some looked away. Behind him, the American flag sagged in the breeze. Sarah did not raise her head. She had not spoken since the night the soldier died, his blood still staining the floor of the hayloft behind Murphy's General Store. They said she'd stabbed him with a broken bottle. They said he'd offered her work and she'd repaid him with murder. But no one mentioned how he'd cornered her first. No one spoke of the scratches down her arms, or the screams heard through the night that were never investigated. They only spoke of the silence that followed. On the edge of the platform stood Reverend Joseph, her adoptive father, hands clasped, head bowed. His face was gray with shame, but he said nothing. Not for her. Not for the child he once called daughter. The town's sheriff, a red-faced man with a limp and a thirst, stepped forward and held the noose in one hand. "Execution set for dawn," he said, "by order of Red Bluff." The crowd began to disperse, dust rising under their boots. But then, hoofbeats. Not hurried, not loud, just steady. People turned. From the east road, through the dying light, a lone rider approached. He wore no badge, no cross, no hat. His skin was deep as the earth, his eyes darker still. Braids hung past his shoulders, and a single eagle feather trembled behind his ear. He dismounted without a word, walking his horse into the square. When he reached the foot of the gallows, he looked up, not at the mayor, not at the sheriff, but directly at Sarah. And then he spoke. "She does not die today." The wind seemed to pause. "I demand the trial of arrows." Gasps scattered like dry seeds. Mayor Cutler stepped forward, indignant. "What in the hell are you talking about?" The stranger's gaze did not waver. "I am Lone Hawk of the Nakoni Band. I invoke our right. She is owed the wind's judgment, not your rope." "There's no such right in this town," the sheriff snapped. Lone Hawk turned to face him. "Then perhaps this town needs reminding." Behind him, the horse stood still, as if it too were waiting. Sarah lifted her eyes, just barely, her lips parted, but no sound came. Yet in that moment someone had spoken for her. The mayor opened his mouth to argue, but Reverend Joseph stepped forward at last, voice quiet but firm. "He speaks the truth. I saved this man's mother from a noose in Dodge. He repays that debt now." A hush fell. No one knew what to say. The sheriff muttered, "She gets 3 days. After that she hangs." Lone Hawk nodded once. "Then 3 days is all the truth needs." The crowd had not yet dispersed. Whispers clung to the edges of the square like smoke after gunfire. The noose still hung from the scaffold beam, swaying slightly in the desert wind. Mayor Hendricks, face flushed with fury, stepped down from the judge's bench and walked straight up to the warrior. His boots struck the ground harder than necessary, each stomp a warning. "You can't come in here and disrupt the order of this town with fairy tales and tribal games," he barked. The Comanche warrior, unmoved, met his glare without blinking. "My name is Lone Hawk," he said calmly. "And this is no game. Your town hangs a girl who cannot speak, and yet you never asked who might speak for her." "She was found over a body with a bloody knife," Hendrik spat. "You think you can walk in and declare some pagan trial, and we all just bow to it?" "I am not asking you to bow," Lone Hawk said evenly. "I am claiming the right of 3 days' mercy." The murmur returned, louder now. Some townsfolk looked to each other with uncertainty. Others stared at Lone Hawk as though waiting for more. Lone Hawk turned, gesturing toward the girl bound on the scaffold. "She is not a stranger to my people. Sarah May is the adopted daughter of Joseph Thornton, a man who once saved my mother from being slaughtered by drunk cavalrymen." All eyes turned to Reverend Thornton, still standing at the foot of the scaffold. His hands trembled slightly as he stepped forward. His voice, when it came, was thin but steady. "It is true," he said. "Years ago I was traveling south toward Las Cruces. I came upon a woman, wounded, bleeding, hiding beneath a broken wagon. Soldiers had raided her family's camp. I gave her food, bandaged her wounds, and led her to the river crossing." He looked at Lone Hawk. "That woman was your mother?" Lone Hawk nodded once. "She carried the scar on her hand from your stitching. She named me Lone Hawk because I was born the day after you helped her fly from death." The Reverend turned to the mayor. "If there is still a soul in this town, it owes something to that past." Mayor Hendricks's jaw twitched. He looked at the faces around him, uneasy but not hostile. Red Bluff was too small to afford scandal, too exposed to call Comanche bluff, too steeped in pride to admit error. "What does this 3 days' mercy mean?" the mayor asked grudgingly. 3 days under the eyes of the spirits," Lone Hawk said. 3 sunsets and 3 dawns. In that time truth may rise from silence. No harm may come to her. If her soul is impure, the wind will turn against her. If it is clean, the land will speak. "Superstition," Hendricks muttered. "Honor," Lone Hawk replied. The Reverend stepped forward again. "And if we refuse?" Lone Hawk's voice dropped to a quiet edge. "Then I will take my people's law into your land, and no man from Red Bluff will cross Comanche soil without answer." It was not a threat, it was a promise made with grave dignity. The kind of promise that came not from rage, but from oath. The mayor swallowed hard. "Fine," he snapped. 3 days. At dawn on the 4th, we carry out the sentence if no proof is found." Lone Hawk gave a single nod. "That is enough." Clara Meadows, standing in the crowd, clutched her apron. "I knew her mother," she whispered. "I never believed she'd kill a man, not even one like that soldier." Sarah May stood motionless, but her eyes followed Lone Hawk as he approached the scaffold. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "You don't remember me," he said softly. Her head tilted slightly, uncertain. "When you were 12, you brought bandages to a woman hiding in the church cellar. You told her she had kind eyes. That was my mother. You touched her shoulder, then ran. You never saw her again." He stepped closer, eyes locked with hers. "Your father once gave my mother a name. I intend to return the debt." Sarah's lips parted. No words, only the soft flutter of breath. But something passed between them. A recognition that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with faith. And so the trial began, not in a courtroom, but under sky and time and wind. 3 days of mercy, and maybe, just maybe, enough room for one lost voice to find its way home. The sun broke slowly over the dry hills outside Red Bluff, casting long shadows that cut across the land like old scars. Lone Hawk led a small procession, silent, reluctant, beyond the town's edge to a place his people called the Wind's Teeth, a jagged labyrinth of sandstone spires weathered by centuries of storm. Sarah May walked in the center, her steps slow but steady. Though her wrists were now free, the silence around her felt heavier than any rope. She had not spoken since the night of the assault. She could not after what was taken from her in that barn. "This is madness," one of the deputies muttered, as they reached the mouth of the maze. "No," Lone Hawk said, his voice low but firm. "This is the wind's court." He stepped forward, holding up a white feather, long and clean, pulled from a hawk's wing. "This is the first arrow, Wind. She must walk the maze alone. If fear breaks her, if she turns back or drops the feather, the arrow fails. The trial ends." Sarah looked to the stones, sharp, high, twisted like the bones of the earth. A breeze moved through them already, whispering in a language only the land understood. Lone Hawk handed her the feather. "If you carry nothing else, carry this with courage." She nodded. Just once. Without ceremony, without farewell, she stepped into the stone maze. The wind came immediately, sharp, rising, wrapping around her like claws. Her skirt whipped against her knees. Dust filled her eyes. She blinked against it, coughed once, but did not stop. The path narrowed quickly, forcing her to turn sideways, then crawl. Sand scraped her palms. The feather trembled in her grip. At a sharp bend, a sudden gust ripped her shawl from her shoulders. It flew behind her, lost in the wind. She did not look back. Her jaw set. Her breath came fast and shallow, but she moved forward. From a nearby ridge, the townspeople watched in silence. Most still looked on with skepticism, but a few, the children, the old preacher, seemed unsure now, unsure of what they believed, or what they were witnessing. "She is just a girl," the mayor muttered. "Why let this nonsense continue?" "Because the wind does not lie," Lone Hawk answered, "and it asks nothing of her but truth." As Sarah rounded the final turn, the corridor narrowed again, and a wall of wind slammed into her like a scream. Her body jerked back, feet sliding on the stone. She dropped to one knee, head bowed. Her hands trembled. But the feather held. She stood, legs shaking, and pushed through the last few steps. When she emerged, her dress was torn, her hair matted, her face streaked with grit, but the feather, though crushed slightly in her fingers, remained. There was no applause. But Lone Hawk stepped forward and placed a folded cloth, wet from his own canteen, on a flat stone. Sarah saw it. She bent, picked it up, and pressed it to her forehead. Her eyes closed. Her breath shuddered out of her. And then she cried. Silently, deeply. Tears not of pain or fear, but of something released. When she looked up, she met Lone Hawk's eyes. No words were spoken, none needed to be. The first arrow had held. They gathered again at dusk. The winds had stilled, but the memory of them clung to Sarah May's hair and clothes like smoke. Her legs ached from the day before, her fingers were still scraped and raw, but she did not flinch when Lone Hawk brought forth the second arrow, a slender shaft wrapped in red thread and tipped with charred obsidian. "The second arrow," he said, holding it up for all to see, "is fire." They were in the town square now, in full view of everyone. A single candle, thick and worn, was set into the dirt, its wick already lit, its flame dancing uncertainly in the evening breeze. "She will sit by this flame until the sun rises," Lone Hawk explained. "Her hand must remain above it. If the flame goes out, the arrow breaks. If she quits, the trial ends." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A grizzled man in a deputy's coat laughed, shaking his head. "What kind of trial is that? What's next, chasing rainbows?" More laughter followed, but not from everyone. Some of the townsfolk, especially children too young to understand hate, watched with wide eyes. Their parents hissed at them to look away, but they stayed. Sarah May knelt beside the candle. Her hands trembled as she lifted one above the flame, fingers spread, palm facing down. The heat was immediate, insistent. Her eyes fluttered, but she did not move. Lone Hawk stepped back, settled into a crouch several feet away. He said nothing, did nothing, just sat, watching, guarding. The hours crawled. The town square emptied, then filled again. Some came to mock, others, curious, lingered in silence. The sheriff paced nearby, sneering every so often. The Reverend stood at the edge of the street, unmoving, holding a book he did not open. Sarah's hand did not waver. At midnight, a gust of wind caught the flame, nearly extinguishing it, but Lone Hawk stood and blocked the breeze with his cloak until it steadied. Then he returned to his place, without a word. The children returned too, one by one, peeking from windows or huddling beside barrels. They whispered questions their parents would not answer. Where's she doing that? Is she hurting? Is she praying? No one could say. By the third hour before dawn, Sarah May's shoulders slumped forward. Her knees were bruised, her eyes rimmed in red. A blister had begun to form across the base of her fingers. Still, she held firm. The candle was small now, its wax melted in trembling rivers, pooling at its base. The flame danced lower and lower, but still burned. Just before sunrise, as the stars began to fade and the sky took on the color of old ash, Sarah's hand faltered. Her arm shook. Her eyes welled with tears, not of fear, not even of pain, but of sheer exhaustion. Then Lone Hawk rose. He walked toward her slowly, the second arrow still in hand. He said nothing until he stood directly in front of her, the tip of the arrow raised, pointing to his own chest. He touched it gently to the place over his heart. "Your pain," he said, "honors truth." Sarah May looked up at him, her arm still raised, her hand still burning. "You do not have to speak to be heard," he added, his voice a hush that still carried to every corner of the square. At that moment the candle flickered, then flared bright as the first ray of sunlight broke over the rooftops. Sarah lowered her hand. The flame still lived, and so did the second arrow. The final morning dawned with a hush, as if even the wind dared not interrupt. The fire at the center of the sacred ring burned low, fed only by cedar and silence. Sarah May stood at the edge, her eyes steady, her posture calm. Her hands, though scarred and raw, did not shake. The third arrow, blood, lay across a stone. Unlike the others, this one bore a small ceremonial blade, sheathed in leather, dyed with ochre, and marked by time. Lone Hawk stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "This is the final trial," he said, "the arrow of blood." He looked directly at Sarah May, not to spill, but to trust. He drew the blade from its sheath, held it flat in his palm, then extended it to her. "If you are guilty, you will fear the truth that lives inside your chest. If you are not, you will hold this to your heart, and it will not tremble." Sarah reached forward, fingers grazing the bone handle. For a moment she paused, not out of hesitation, but reverence. Then she took it. The circle was silent. Even the townspeople who had once scoffed now held their breath. Somewhere beyond the trees, a hawk cried out once, then vanished. Sarah turned the blade, its edge gleaming faintly in the morning light. She placed the flat against her chest, just over her heart, and closed her eyes. He did not move. She did not flinch. Her breath was steady. And then, from the crowd, a woman screamed. White heads turned as a figure stumbled forward. Thin, ragged, her dress torn, hair matted with dirt and sweat, she looked like a ghost pulled from a grave. Lone Hawk stepped protectively between her and Sarah, but the woman held up a shaking hand. "I have to speak," she rasped. The sheriff frowned. "Who the hell are you?" The woman coughed, then stood straighter, eyes fierce. "Annabelle Greeley," she said. "I was married to Private Thomas Greeley, the man this girl is accused of killing." A murmur ran through the crowd. The mayor stepped forward. "You were presumed dead. Your husband said—" "My husband lied," she snapped. "He lied about everything. He beat me, he beat other women. And that night I followed him, because I knew he had his knife." She turned to Sarah, tears welling in her eyes. "I saw him drag her into that barn. I saw her try to fight. I saw him raise the knife." She looked down at her trembling hands. "And I stabbed him, not her, me." The crowd gasped. "I ran. I was afraid. No one would believe a broken woman. I hid in the hills. But when I heard what they were doing to her, I couldn't let it happen." Sarah's eyes widened, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She still held the blade to her chest, but now with understanding. Not just for herself, but for the woman who had carried her guilt in silence. The mayor was speechless. The sheriff stepped back, his hand no longer near his weapon. Lone Hawk turned to the mayor. 3 sons. 3 truths. This is the final one. He gently took the blade from Sarah's hand and drove it point first into the earth. Her blood is clean. Annabelle dropped to her knees before Sarah, reaching out. I am sorry. I did what I could. Sarah knelt beside her, and for the first time in months, her lips parted, and she spoke. Thank you. Her voice was broken, dry, barely more than a whisper, but every soul in the circle heard it. Lone Hawk looked down, then up again. His voice was quiet. Now the trial is done. The third morning arrived without fanfare. The sky, a bruised watercolor, stretched across the horizon, and a hush settled over Red Bluff like ash after a blaze. Townspeople gathered in the square slowly, almost reverently, some drifting in late, others leaning against fence posts, as if the event before them was something fragile or forbidden, and they weren't sure whether to stare or look away. In the center stood Sarah May, a solitary figure etched against the dust and dawn light. Her dress, once neat and white, was now frayed at the hem and dusty. Her arms bore the faint purple of bruises, and her face was pale, yet resolute. Over 3 days, it seemed, she had emptied herself of fear, shame, and words, leaving only the quiet weight of determination. Despite it, she stood straighter than she ever had, like she had learned to carry this newly discovered armor of her own making. Beside the sheriff stood Lone Hawk, silent as a rock in the sun-baked earth. He didn't look at anyone else, only at Sarah. His eyes held no triumph, no challenge, but something steadier. Respect and a promise kept. The judge, his gavel trembling in clenched hand, stepped onto what had been the gallows platform. He looked out at the crowd and took a breath that carried the weight of every questioning glance before him. She has completed the 3 days, he began. Voice hushed, yet audible. By tribal law, she is proven pure in spirit. There is no sentence left to give. A collective exhale rippled through the square, as though every person had held their breath in fear or anticipation. The rope still hung above the platform, its noose a silent witness, but it had lost its power, its purpose. Sarah May did not cry, uncomfortable with emotion. She did not smile, wary of joy's sudden betrayal. She simply stepped off the platform of her own accord, her movements quiet, her gaze forward. Someone in the crowd scoffed sharply. She should have swung, a rough voice called. Law's law! But not far away, a younger voice, nervous but free, answered back. She did more than any of us would have dared. Another followed. I didn't see no guilt in her. Slowly, the crowd formed lines, some clinging to anger and the old rules, others shifting toward recognition of the woman leaving before them. Justice here hadn't been blind, it had been kind, but raw and human all the same. Reverend Thornton, Sarah's adoptive father, stepped forward, his gait uneven, his face etched with remorse and longing. He reached Sarah and wrapped her in a firm, tremulous embrace, bridging the distance of 3 days of chaos. I was supposed to protect you, he whispered into her hair, voice heavy with confessions. But he did. Sarah froze for a moment, her arms tense at her sides. She didn't pull away, but neither could she return to that protective fold. She stepped back, leveling her gaze on the man who truly had honored her. Lone Hawk remained where he stood, tall and open, the final sacred arrow still sheathed across his back. He didn't speak, but his eyes carried an invitation without demand. Sarah's chest tightened, then relaxed. She walked toward him, steadying each step as though it mattered beyond fate. The crowd parted or turned, but no one moved to stop her. No one dared. She reached his side. No words were exchanged, but the simple press of her palm into his, gentle and sure, said more than any vow could. She belonged beside him, under the same sky he had honored her under. They turned and began walking out of the square, away from the gallows and the law that almost stole her voice, and toward a horizon of possibilities no longer bounded by prejudice. From the crowd came murmurs, some puzzled, some scornful, others uplifted. "She's going with him?" a voice asked. "She's still a sinner," another muttered. "She's more woman than any of you raise," snapped someone else. The voices overlapped and tangled, then faded in the early morning light. A small girl, the blacksmith's daughter, tugged at her father's sleeve. "Papa," she asked softly, "is she free now?" The man, big and steady and worn with labor, looked from his daughter to Sarah's retreating back. He saw her stride, stable and honorable, beside the Comanche warrior, who offered her not protection from fear, but acknowledgement of her truth. He nodded once, small but certain. "Yes," he said softly, "she is." The moon hung heavy above the cottonwood trees, casting a silver hush over the land beyond the river. Here, in a small hollow surrounded by earth and old stones, a fire burned low, tame but alive. Lone Hawk sat on one side of the flames, legs folded, palms resting on his knees. Sarah May sat across from him, wrapped in a shawl stitched with the frayed memories of town life. Neither of them had spoken in over an hour. The fire crackled softly, shifting shadows across their faces. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called, its cry carrying a lonely sort of peace. Sarah's fingers tightened around the cup of herbal tea she held. She hadn't drunk it yet. It was not the bitterness she feared, it was the sound of her own voice, if it tried to rise. Lone Hawk did not press her. He never had. Since the moment he rode into Red Bluff and claimed her life beneath the eyes of 100 doubters, he had not once asked for her story. He had only offered space, soft, steady, and waiting. She stared into the flames, and he did the same. Then she spoke. It came not as a scream or a sob, but a whisper, rough and broken, as if the words had waited too long inside her throat. "Thank you for seeing me." The wind did not move. The fire did not crack. Even the earth seemed to still. Lone Hawk raised his eyes slowly, not startled, but reverent. He did not smile, but something in him shifted, like the turning of a page. He did not reply with words. Instead, he reached forward, across the firelight, and placed 2 fingers gently on her wrist, just above the faint bruises where rope had once held her. "The trope will not define you," he said, his voice low and sure. "This fire will." Her eyes filled, not from pain, but from something she had not known she missed. Being heard. "I was never loud," she whispered, "even before. You do not need to be. I used to believe silence was weakness." He shook his head slowly. "Silence is what kept your truth safe, until now." She blinked, and a tear slipped free. It landed on her sleeve, darkening the cloth. "I remember you," she said. "I was 11. Your mother came to our chapel. She had a wound. I helped bandage her arm." He nodded once. "You were with her," she continued. "I held the basin, you poured the water." "I never forgot," he said. "The girl with the quiet hands." Silence returned, but this time it was not cold. It was warm, thick with breath, and something fragile that did not yet have a name. Sarah reached out across the fire, her fingers brushing the edge of his. He turned his hand and let her lace hers with his, light, unsure but no longer afraid. "Will the town forget?" she asked after a time. "No," he said simply, "but they will grow tired of remembering, and when they do, you will already be free." "Where will we go?" "Somewhere with no fences, no gallows." She closed her eyes and nodded. The stars blinked above them, ancient and indifferent, but in that hollow, beneath the bones of sky and wind, something new had taken root. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of it. A kind of reverence, a kind of choice. The fire burned low, the wind shifted, and for the first time in a long, long time, Sarah May did not feel small. She felt seen. And that, at last, was enough. A year passed. The town of Red Bluff remained, its windows shuttered against dust, its church bells still rang on Sundays, but neither Sarah May nor Lone Hawk ever looked back. They had crossed the river, both literally and in spirit, and built a new home, where the cottonwoods bent low over a slow-moving stream, and the hills rolled out like a quiet prayer. Their home was modest, a one-room cabin with a pitched roof and smoke that curled peacefully into the sky. But outside, life bloomed. A garden of herbs and wildflowers framed the front steps. A row of boughs hung near the doorway, each strung with care. Inside, a stack of well-worn books sat beside a clay bowl of sage and flint. In this place, Sarah May taught. Each morning, children gathered beneath the trees. White, brown, Lakota, Comanche, any child whose parents trusted a woman who had once been left to die. She wrote words in the dirt with a stick, let them sound out letters, taught them the shapes of questions and answers. Lone Hawk sat nearby, always nearby, sharpening arrows, teaching older boys how to read tracks, how to hunt with purpose, not pride. One afternoon, as Sarah wiped her chalk-dusted hands and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a small voice rose from the circle. "Are you his wife?" The question came from a boy no older than 8, his eyes round and open. The other children stilled, curious too, but unsure if they could ask. Sarah looked at Lone Hawk, who was pretending not to listen but had stopped moving altogether. She smiled. "I am no one's wife," she said, her voice gentle, even, "but I belong where I am seen." The children nodded, satisfied with that, maybe even a little awed. Later that evening, the wind carried the scent of rain. Sarah stood at the edge of the bluff above their home, watching clouds gather along the distant ridges. Lone Hawk joined her in silence, their shoulders brushing as they looked toward the sunset. In his hand he carried 3 arrows, one fletched in white, one in red, and one in black. "They are ready?" she asked. He nodded. She took the first arrow, the white one, fletched with eagle down, and held it in both hands. "For wind," she whispered. Then the red one, trimmed in feathers dyed with bloodroot. "For fire," she said. Finally, the black arrow, wrapped at the base with a strip of old cloth, the same cloth from the noose that had once threatened her life. "For blood." She looked at him. He handed her the flint and tinder, and together they knelt on the rock. One by one they lit the arrows, not to launch them, but to let them burn. The flames rose slow, then fierce, curling upward as the sky darkened. "This is not law," she said quietly. "This is promise." "Justice," he murmured, "is not made in courts. It is made in what we dare protect." The fire danced between them, reflected in their eyes. They did not kiss. They did not need to. The space between them was already full, with memory, with vow, with the quiet certainty of 2 people who had chosen not only each other, but a way of living. "Parry!" Behind them, the children's laughter echoed down the hill. A soft drumbeat began from the village, someone calling dusk into being. Sarah touched the scars on her wrist, now faded but still there. "Not who I was," she said. Lone Hawk placed a hand over hers. "And yet," he said, "you never stopped being who you are." As the last arrow burned to ash, the wind rose, not harsh but warm, like breath, like blessing. They stood on the bluff until only embers remained. And in that space between what had been and what could be, they chose again. Not survival, not vengeance, not even hope, but presence. Love not as ownership, but as reflection. Justice not as verdict, but as witness. And Sarah May, once silent beneath a noose, now stood beneath the stars, unclaimed, unbroken, and utterly, finally seen. If this story moved you, if Sarah May's quiet courage and Lone Hawk's unwavering honor stirred something deep, then you belong with us. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales where justice is earned, not given, where love defies law, loss, and silence, where every heart that was once cast out finds its place again, on the dusty roads, in the firelight, and in the arms of someone who sees them. This is where forgotten voices rise. This is where love remembers. Subscribe now. The next story may be the one that finally breaks your heart and makes it whole again.